Welcome to this special look back at the 1963 March on Washington. I'm Lori Stokes. And for the next half hour, as we reflect on the significance of the march, you're going to hear from celebrities who were there sharing their stories, and from others who say their activism is just getting started despite COVID-19 restrictions. I'll also share never-before-seen amateur video filmed on that day 57 years ago, shot in color on an 8mm camera by my father, Congressman Lori Stokes. Yes, that's me in my dad's arms with my family. We traveled from Cleveland, where my father was a civil rights attorney who worked alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the national movement to register black voters. The video gives you the feeling you are there in the middle of hundreds of thousands of people. He even captures moments of baseball great Jackie Robinson signing autographs. Dr. Maya Angelou said, "You can't really know where you are going until you know where you have been." On that day, almost 60 years ago, the youngest speaker, the late Congressman John Lewis, was just 23 years old, but he would go on to see this generation make good trouble. So are we seeing an evolution or a revolution with the Black Lives Matter movement and a raised consciousness of justice for all? This year's march is led by the Reverend Al Sharpton and the National Action Network. And nearly 3 decades later, we are still fighting the same issues. We begin with an interview I did with my late father, Congressman Lori Stokes, in 2013 on the 50th anniversary of the march. He told me how, like Dr. King, everyone there had a dream. The question is, was it realized?
I think for some people, they have been realized to some degree. We have to recognize that in the 50 years that we have made progress. In 1963, there were only 6 black congresspersons. I joined the Congress in January of 1969. And that made 9 of us when the 3 of us came in that day to join the others. Obviously, we've made progress. What we've done is to achieve, but it has been minimal. And therefore, you have to acknowledge the fact that while we've made progress, we still have a long way to go. I think that many of our young people are concerned about what is happening in our country at this time. When President Barack Obama ran for the presidency, we saw white kids in colleges all over America. Many of them left the college campuses and went across the country following Barack Obama and being a part of his campaign. They didn't see him as a black man. All they saw was that this was somebody who was a leader and someone who was saying and talking about the kind of concerns they have about the kind of an America they want to live in. And so many of them were involved in that campaign. And so that was the first time we had seen young people galvanized, active again, since back in the 60s when we had college campuses that were disrupted by young people who were concerned about the military industrial complex. They were concerned about poverty in our country. They were concerned about militarism and racism. And we had not seen that until about 5 years ago. What John Lewis, who was 23 years old on the day he stood at that podium and spoke to the nation 50 years ago, what he was doing was reminiscing and thinking about how the galvanizing, aggressive, rebellious young man he was at 23. And he was talking to young people who were his age then, telling them to be like he was.
We will march with the spirit of love and with the spirit of dignity that we have shown here today.
I didn't remember him by name, but I remember that speech. It was fiery. And I remember that they begged him to take out something that was really very revolutionary, which he very reluctantly did. But it was this young, I remember thinking, oh, who is this? Who is this? My God, he's like Martin.
He was a student of nonviolent protesting.
And he was talking to young people who were his age then, telling them to be like he was, to go back in your districts and be concerned about agitating, as he put it today, and stirring things up, and helping to make our country today what it should be.
John Lewis and I were at the Selma Montgomery March, 50th anniversary together. We were the only two people on that night who spoke or sang at the first one, Lori. This was a concert that Harry Belafonte had organized on the next night, right? 30,000 people, and he got up on stage and he said, you know, the civil rights movement without music would have been a bird without wings. Harry was the one who got all the musicians together, Mahalia Jackson, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul and Mary. He was a giant in all this. And the voices at that point of the arts were powerful connection points for people in terms of our participation in these events. And so when I think of this era and I think of what we shared, I think of that legacy and how important that is.
My philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
As the march continues, so does the movement. Still ahead, we'll hear from famous voices echoing familiar tones.
BLM, Black Lives Matter. It's a rallying cry to injustices that have perpetuated Black people for decades. Meant not to minimize or exclude, but to say all lives matter. A moment of worldwide reckoning came in May at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were quarantined and not distracted, and watched a white Minneapolis police officer kneeling on a Black man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while he pleaded for his life, repeating the words, "I can't breathe." George Floyd's death galvanized global protests from New York to Paris to Kenya to Sydney to Israel, reminiscent of the civil rights movement and the March on Washington. Today, the famous are using their voices.
When you break it down, it's a human rights issue. It's, you know, we can go race. It's just human rights. You know, just you can't treat people differently because of their color, ethnicity, their race, their sexual anything. If we're humans, we all have to be treated equally.
I was going to be 9 years old in '63, but I remember the march because I was already a board preacher. I knew Mahalia Jackson as a board preacher. I remember the speech. Dr. King said that he dreamed of a day that his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character.
So talk to us about the plans for the March on Washington this year.
Plans are really that if you go to '63, 57 years ago, they came to Washington trying to get a Civil Rights Act and then a Voting Rights Act. They were able with a march to help contribute to the climate that led to that legislation. We come at a time that policing is a real problem, as personified by George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Rashad Brooks.
I was walking across Ventura and Corbin, and I look to the left of me, and I see a gun raised coming towards my direction. I was thinking, okay, somebody's about to get it. I don't know what they did, but I must be in the middle of it. I don't know why. No, get on the ground. You. Oh, okay. I got on the ground. They told me to spread my hands out like I was on an airplane or whatever. And at that point, that's when an officer one officer came, got on top of me. The other 3 officers hopped out of the car. There was another officer in front of me. I wouldn't have been walking had I been running through that situation, and I had my Bose headphones on, and I didn't hear that cop, and he had his gun out. The headline would have been totally different.
To me, as a black man growing up in New York City, and I had a lot of run-ins with negative and bad police officers. I can't even tell you the countless of times that had I not piped down, something like that could have happened to me. I really believe that his death is not going to go in vain. I think that his death had to happen for change to take place.
When I look at the fact that we've seen young people and older people, intergenerational, marching since George Floyd, some never stopped in Portland and Seattle and Louisville. They've been marching every day. I think that we've seen a movement like they had in '63. We look at the march, but the march was in the context of a lot of other activism, as this march is. We're saying that the George Floyd Policing and Justice Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill must be passed. We must add legislation with demonstration so that people will not be despondent and feel that all of this is for nothing.
On a personal level for you, what keeps you up at night?
I think what keeps me up at night is to know that so many people invested so much that we have been able to see that they not be disappointed that they gave so much and we squandered it with our apathy, our inactivity, or in our self-indulgence. I remember as a kid watching Carl Stokes and Richard Hatcher become mayor. We never dreamed that there'd be black mayors.
The night that my brother Carl was elected as mayor of Cleveland, it was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when we finally got word from the election board that Carl had actually won. The whole campaign headquarters emptied out. Everyone went downstairs. Dr. King, who was in headquarters that night, stayed upstairs in the headquarters. My brother Carl asked me if I would stay up there with Dr. King, and everyone else went downstairs to a jubilant crowd. 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, people were dancing in the streets with the knowledge that Cleveland had elected the first black mayor of a major American city.
I was blessed in my life to have worked in the movement and known great people that did great things. I've been able to sit with Nelson Mandela and sit with Mrs. King. I've been able for 8 years to have access to the first black president, Barack Obama. And to go from all of that to now where we can't stop a cop from putting a knee on somebody's neck, I'm up at night saying that I cannot one day go off to the next light and face my elders saying that I did not do what I should have done to keep preserving what they gave us.
Up next, 2 legendary performers reflect upon the important impact of music and film.
Music and theater are known as universal healers, and no one can deny Peter, Paul, and Mary were the epitome of that sentiment as they performed in front of the Lincoln Memorial on that sweltering day in Washington, D.C. 57 years ago. And actress Rita Moreno, who had just won her Oscar for West Side Story 2 years prior, had goosebumps while standing near Dr. King as he gave his moving "I Have a Dream" speech. These artists know that as much as we revere the past, you can't live in it, but you can learn from it.
How many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? And that's when we sang that line at the March on Washington in 1963. That was the line that related directly to the 250,000 people who were there. And they knew that song because it hit the top of the charts the week before, and it was the first time they heard Bob Dylan. And so if you look at it, at the crowd and the videos of it, they had their hands up like this and they were singing the chorus with us. And it was a moment when it was much more than a performance of a song. And it stayed with Peter, Paul, and Mary for the rest of our careers, because it was at that moment that we realized that the mountain could move. And once you know that, you are encouraged to continue to do so, and we have.
You're talking about one of the most exquisite experiences of my life, if not the most, except for the birth of my daughter.
I know that you were there 2 years after winning your Oscar, and you were there with other celebrities. Paint the picture for me of that day.
Unbelievable. Actually, you can find, there were very few pictures of the artists who came at Harry Belafonte's invitation. And one are getting off the plane. It was Marlon Brando, Sammy Davis Jr., James Garner. When I talk about it, I still get goosebumps, because I remember at one point turning around. We were, by the way, we were about 15 feet, no more, from Dr. King. We were on the same level. We were on where the Lincoln Monument was. And I remember turning around and looking at the pool, and seeing thousands and thousands of faces and people, lots of people in overalls, some of whom had walked. It was, the beginning of that civil rights movement. It was the beginning where it was official, let's put it that way, because before then there'd been many things. And it's where I found romance with Jimmy Foreman, who was part of SNCC. And the head of SNCC was John Lewis.
I remember you talking about Mahalia Jackson.
And I'll tell you why. She was a very good friend of Dr. King's. She was sitting, I think it was right next to him. And he got up to make his speech. And it was a prepared speech that was not the one we know. And at one point she said, and I heard her say this, I was there. She said, "Martin, tell him about the dream. Tell him about the dream, Martin." And so he put down his other prepared speech and started to talk. And he started to say, "I had a dream."
Goosebumps, right?
Oh my goodness, yeah. And that's when he got into that part of the speech that everyone remembers.
This march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
These are magical moments. It's like the magical moment when people get married. That moment, everybody feels there's something in the room that is bringing them to a sense that life is full now and intense and beautiful. And frankly, we had that in spades down there in '63, where Mary took my hand and she said, "Peter, we're watching history being made." Look, that was the defining moment for the world in certain ways, because that was the moment that showed that in contemporary times that ordinary people, not elected officials, but people, grassroots people, if they got together and a quarter, I mean, we didn't know going there whether there were going to be guns and violence or whatever, but it was so filled with love, you could just scoop it up. And so, these are definitive moments, because when you know that the people themselves can make a difference when they band together. It doesn't come from on high. It doesn't come from the wealthy or for the successful or even from the elected leaders. The civil rights movement did not proceed from the top down. It came from the people.
Thank you for joining us for the March, Then and Now, Marching for Change special. I'm Lori Stokes. I want to leave you with a quote from Dr. King. There is no sound more powerful than the marching feet of a determined people. The dream he spoke of and fought for, has it been realized? What would you say?
The song about love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. Lori Stokes, all over this land.